you see the crime being committed. You see the child being killed. You see the house being destroyed. You see the hospital being brought down. And with it, the commentary comes that, no, this is a lie.
How does that influence the growth and the nature of what the Muslim Brotherhood becomes?
And I don't have the statistics for this, but I'm told that they exist in over 82 countries. The message of Hassan al-Banna was very simple. It was that Islam is probably the most motivating, the most revolutionary message known to mankind.
As you mentioned that there was a strict adherence to non-violence, right? But at the same time, there were brigades going to fight. So, I mean, just clarify that.
I was one of those people who contacted my friends in Egypt, whom I knew at the time, and I said, what are you doing? This is historic. This is incredible. Why are you sitting in your offices and at home? People are on the streets. Why aren't you there? I mean, this I can't forget. I was, after this lecture given at York University, someone came to me and apparently they were some sort of influencer with over 200,000 followers. So I was saying, well, give me your, and I opened TikTok and the first thing that comes out is this Iraqi dance of some sort. It was embarrassing.
Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Karim. Today, I'm speaking to Anas Altikriti. Anas, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashfaq.
Anas is the CEO and founder of the Cordoba Foundation. He has been involved and was the former president of MAB, the Muslim Association of Britain. I'm speaking to Anas today about the Muslim Brotherhood, just who they are. Recently, about a week ago, Trump ordered his executive team to investigate whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood should be banned in Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. So we're going to be discussing that. But in order to discuss that, we kind of need a history of who the Muslim Brotherhood are. I think there's a perception in the world today when people who may not know the history, they think of radical Muslims. Some may think terrorism. Some may think Mohammed Morsi was once in charge of Egypt. Wasn't he part of the Muslim Brotherhood? How would you answer that question? Who's the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I think it's firstly important to note that the Muslim Brotherhood is almost 100 years old. They were established by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt in 2028. So we're around 97 years, 98 years almost since the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood was founded on quite simple and clear values, principles, and sets of basics that appealed at the time to Muslims who were, you have to realize the context of time, bereft as a result of the dissemination and the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, i.e. what today is often referred to as Khilafah. So in a way, the political leadership, the political reference point to Muslims East and West was no more. And they were left under colonialism. Most Arab and Muslim countries were living under either British or French colonial powers or under mandates by the British and French. And nations were basically rid of their resources, rid of their potentials, rid of, to be honest, even ambitions. I mean, the biggest dreams that nations had at the time was to travel to France or to live in France or to live in the UK or to be educated in a university somewhere in the West. It was basically a total ripping apart and separation between the individual and the land where they came from, culturally as well as politically, economically, and it was totally disempowering. So the message that Hassan al-Banna proposed was that by returning to the very basics of Islam and understanding Islam in a totally new way, which hadn't been the case for decades, let's just say, throughout the Muslim world, and that is that Islam is a driving force, is a motivation on so many levels, starting from the personal, going through society, reaching the highest echelons of how states are run, And every single sphere that we can think of, whether it be spiritual, whether it be economic, whether it be political, is somehow impacted by the very basics of Islam. And he relied on verses that were, recited every day in mosques and quoted every day by the then imams and the like. So bringing all that to life, bringing the Quran that was recited in daily prayers or mentioned on pulpits in mosques to life, to tell people that this is something where you can once again engage with not only your history, but engage with yourself and your current potential on every single sphere, was, in my view, looking back, almost 100 years ahead, was absolutely brilliant. And the sign of that brilliance was that within a matter of a few years, there were hordes of people, particularly in Egypt, but not exclusively, hordes of people who subscribed to this message, who saw this person, who, by the way, was a young man. I mean, when he started his school, he was 22 years old. Yet he managed to engage with particularly the masses, those who were sat on, cafe seats, were playing dominoes and the old games, checkers or whatever the Egyptians used to play back then, listening to the old singers and old Egyptian music, communicating with them and telling them how it's imperative that by returning to the very basics of Islam, that many of today's problems, that kind of yearning towards latching on to a Western civilization that was essentially your master, your colonial head, if you wish, was not the right way to go. It was absolutely devoid of any kind of realism to leave and to desert what you had in terms of spirituality as well as history and language and all of that for something that was fake and that wasn't yours to start off with. So the Muslim Brotherhood then started to grow, and obviously, as usual, when civil society, and essentially I would describe it in today's terms as being a civil society organization, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the entire world. As it grew, and as it started to respond to local as well as regional developments and events, including Palestine, its impact became quite clear. Particularly that the motivation of those thousands, tens of thousands, probably even hundreds of thousands, wasn't financial. It wasn't because anyone was promised some sort of political leadership role or authority, or that they were promised any kind of career, but they were doing this voluntarily. Such a movement becomes a threat to the status quo. It becomes a threat to the state, because otherwise, how do you control them? How do you manage that kind of crowd that is driven by ideals which the state sees as being counter to its own interests? In fact, how does the colonial power in place at the time, how do they deal with those hundreds of thousands of people, ordinary people, unarmed people, defenseless people, but with quite illuminating principles, quite brilliant basics and values which they live by? It's very, very difficult. So what do? You create crises whereby it gives you the legitimacy to crack down. And that's precisely what's happened in terms of a series of events. And it's ended with, after the effective involvement of the Muslim Brotherhood in sending brigades trained, voluntarily to Palestine.
This was from Egypt, right?
This was from Egypt. And it showed quite clearly that these people are driven by a force that isn't financial, isn't material, is quite, if you wish, quite puritanical, quite altruistic, call it as you may. But effectively, these people were driven in a way that was very difficult to control. And that whilst the official Arab armies all just, descended by the lay-by, those people were still willing to put their own lives literally on the line in order to defend Palestine and the Palestinians. So it was a must that something needed to be done, and therefore Hassan al-Banna was assassinated. And assassinated in a way that if you were to, to show in one of today's Hollywood blockbusters, you would barely believe it. Called by a scammer or a fake call to a rendezvous point late at night where the entire area was sealed off, shot several times, left to bleed out, picked up by an ambulance, but no doctor was allowed to come near him until he bled out and died. And then this person, whom hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, I don't have the figures, potentially millions followed and were inspired by, was not allowed anyone from his own family, any menfolk particularly, to walk in his funeral. And therefore he was buried by the womenfolk of his family. His father was allowed solely to walk in his funeral. So, I mean, we're talking about probably the most remarkable figure that has shaped the 20th century, probably even the 21st century. We're still there living through this. But someone whom 100 years on, his message thrives, continues, grows, expands. And one of its most remarkable characteristics and traits and principles is the forbiddance, absolute forbiddance of the use of violence for anything, either for political gain or for, compelling people either to embrace Islam or to embrace any kind of particular way of life, or to deceive, cheat, scam, cheat your way to win any elections. You do it clean. You don't do it, then you don't do it. That's something that is incredibly remarkable. And therefore, and although quite a long introduction, but I think it's quite important, whenever talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and whenever I'm asked to deliver any kind of lecture, academic or otherwise, I always say it's a must that you separate two things that identify the Muslim Brotherhood. The first is the message, the essential message. You could call it ideology if you want. To be honest, if you go through the entire writings, library of Hassan al-Banna, it would be an afternoon's read. It wouldn't be too extensive, and it would be extremely simple. He wasn't a complex, sophisticated thinker. He was quite simple and quite driven in terms of how he communicated with others, and people responded to that quite positively. So you have the message, and then you have the vehicle. You call it the organization, you call it the political party, you call it the association, you call it society, whatever you want to call it. That's the vehicle that delivers the message. And the vehicle could vary from country to country, context to context, place to place, time to time. I mean, the vehicles that are around today are different from the vehicles 50 years ago and the ones during Hassan al-Banna. The message, in my view, and I would attest to it being one of the most brilliant messages promoted and given to human societies, civil human societies that are sure to transform their realities. The vehicle is negotiable. It could be a bad idea, it could be a good idea. You could have people who aren't that, abiding by the principles and the legacies. You could have, wrong methodologies. You could have wrong narratives or the such. So it's very, very important to distinguish between the two. So it's anyone who comes out and says, well, the Muslim Brotherhood is this, or the Muslim Brotherhood is that. My question is often, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the message, which is there? It's in most languages that I know. Or are you talking about the vehicle? Are you talking about the means or the modes of delivery of the message? Which could, they're human ventures, so they're susceptible to erring from time to time. So the Muslim Brotherhood, I would suggest today, is the largest, probably arguably the most important civil society organization. Now, why did
in the Muslim world?
No, I'm talking worldwide.
Okay.
Because, and I don't have the statistics for this, but I'm told that they exist in over 82 countries. Now, I don't know whether that's true. I don't know which countries are excluded. I don't have that. But this is something I've heard and read several times. Now, the reason why I made this distinction between the message and the vehicle is because the message has become a global phenomenon. Now, there are many people out there unbeknowingly adopt the message, but probably criticize and probably often oppose the Muslim Brotherhood. But the message itself is so brilliant, is so simple, is so clearly reflective of the essential principles of Islam in such a way that a 10-year-old can understand, that many people around the world have adopted. They may have an absolute, torrid relationship with their local or regional vehicle of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood Party, the Muslim Brotherhood Association. They may do that. But the message itself has become a global phenomenon. So whilst, some people have quoted there being around 20 million Muslim brothers around the world, I would suggest that the message is adopted by, quite a significant portion of the 2 billion Muslims around the world. Like I said, often inadvertently, without realizing that this message is the message of Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin.
Okay, so there's a few things. I mean, you spoke a lot, and thank you for that, because I think it was very clarifying. But there's a few things I just want to pursue from what you said to kind of give more clarity. So the first is you mentioned that there was a strict adherence to non-violence, right? But at the same time, there were brigades going to fight. So I mean, just clarify that. Not now when I'm done with the question, because I'm going to lay down a few points and then let you speak for quite a while, because I think it's a better way to kind of just let you flow. And then the other thing is you've mentioned this message quite a lot. Can you just, and you mentioned it can be an afternoon's read. Now, there have been, people who've come on and sort of would people, depending on which version of the message you may now as a Muslim Brotherhood adhere to, kind of, there've been people that have come along and built on some sort of intellectual legacy. But before we get to those things, what's the message in your, if you can summarize it for us in a few minutes, what do you think is the essence of the message? But also explain that movement towards violence and the difference between maybe what I'm assuming is internal violence and external violence towards like sort of an armed conflict, as was happening with trying to liberate Palestine at the time that was getting ethnically cleansed. But then the other thing is, I'm assuming it was the British who were, who put those rules in place for Hassan al-Banna's funeral. And I think this is an important thing because they were born in colonialism, and then as they spread to become sort of a civil society network, as you mentioned, they are faced with Arab brutal autocracies. And so how do these influences, and it's a very big question, so I can break it down for you later on again, but how do these influences impact the movement? Well,
a number of questions here, but basically the message of the Muslim Brotherhood, in my view, in my understanding, and I could claim to have read most, I wouldn't say all, but most literature, whether it be written by or presented by Imam Hassan al-Banna, because many of those notes were of his lectures, or what came later on. And essentially the message of Hassan al-Banna was very simple. It was that Islam is probably the most motivating, the most revolutionary message known to mankind. And its potential lies in its simplicity. It's a universal message, meaning that it concerns everyone. It's not just for Muslims. And it concerns every country, every culture, every faith, every background. And it's comprehensive, meaning that it attains or relates to every single sphere of life. That kind of driving force that is guided by a set of values of decency, of truth, of transparency, of justice, that is what corrects how we behave as individuals, how we relate to each other, how societies coexist and integrate, and how the world can be shaped in a way that is, I would suggest, different than how we find it today. And the narrative that this enormous project, if you wish, was presented was extremely simple, very, very clear. Like I said, something that a 10-year-old, when I first started reading those, I think I was about 12 or 13, and I related to them. I mean, obviously the things that I understood back then were different than, what I continued to understand as I grew up. But essentially it's the simplicity of the message, the clarity of the message, and the comprehensiveness of the message. And therefore, for instance, when we come to the debate about political Islam, this was a deliberate ploy in order to demonize Islam's impact on the political status quo. As a good Muslim, you, Ishfaq, you must never ever come close to practicing politics. Or when you do practice politics, you don't bring Islam with you. You leave it at the door. Otherwise, political Islam. You have this red, buzzer shining bright. So that's essentially what I understand to be the basic tenets and message of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, you bring up something which is very, very important. And by the way, this is something that most Muslims would understand quite normally and easily. The concept of jihad, this is something that unfortunately, due to linguistic coinage, due to political references, cultural issues, we're now almost forbidden from talking about. Yet jihad is, I would argue, the most noble value for a Muslim. Jihad is essentially to fight your own whims and desires. It's to fight and overcome your own shortcomings. It's to overcome your reluctance to do good. When you're held back by whether to give to someone in need, and you're thinking, well, will I be able to pay my rent at the end of the month? That jihad within yourself, that struggle will say, well, this person can't eat right now. I'll manage towards the end of the month, but this person I need to help. Resisting a status of oppression. Well, it might cost me my job, but this jihad tells you, you know what? You stand up to power and you rely on your creator to provide and to sustain, but you do the right thing. This is your test. You're inflicted with an illness. You're inflicted with a disability, and you stand that test. That's all down to jihad. Unfortunately, jihad has been totally, brought down to, fighting, imploding bombs and creating terror and all of that, when that is probably the tiniest bit of that spectrum of jihad. You know that in many Arab countries, particularly, but not exclusively Arab countries, the name jihad is quite
Often
well
like
known.
a name for a person, yeah.
And by the way, it's one of those names that are used both for men and women. Jihad. Unfortunately, since particularly 9/11, I would suggest, I dare say that I have not heard of a single friend of mine that has named their child jihad. And for this particular reason, when jihad is such a noble character that, call it as you may, but that is the concept of jihad. So when we talk about the defense of lands against occupation, when we talk about the defense against oppression, when we talk about struggling against injustice, when you're talking about that, first of all, there needs to be a reference point. I mean, and this is part of what the Muslim Brotherhood always, from the day one, always state quite clearly. The reference point is not the self, meaning I can't wake up one morning and say, well, what's happening in this country or that is unjust. I'm going to declare jihad. I'm going to go out and and fight and create chaos or the like, whatever my intentions and whatever the reasons. That doesn't work. That doesn't work not according to the Muslim Brotherhood. It doesn't work according to Islam. There needs to be the political reference point, whether it be the state, whether it be, a higher authority that decides that we are about to go to war. We are about to confront this oppression, this injustice. In the case of Palestine, Arab armies already declared the fact that they were going to defend Palestine, including the Egyptian army. And the Muslim Brotherhood corresponded with the Egyptian armed forces, the official armed forces at the time, and said we were going to send brigades. The surprise came when the size as well as the efficacy and the persistence and the kind of doggedness of the spirits of those fighters were discovered. And when they tried to, just like they did with the armies, an army conscript, you say go ahead, they'll try to go ahead. You say come back, they'll happily come back. But for the Muslim brothers, for them, it was something that was higher than that. It wasn't just a mission or a task that they were undergoing. It was a higher calling, and for something that was extremely holy and very, very important and relevant to their own beings. And therefore, they responded in kind in terms of the way that they fought and the professionalism in which they fought. And as a result, they needed to be demonized for that concept. You see, if you fight and if you manage somehow to eradicate that kind of notion of jihad from a Muslim, to be perfectly honest, I struggle to understand how he or she, can sustain being a Muslim, being a sane human being without that concept of jihad, fighting the urge to do something that is harmful, fighting the urge to engage in drugs, fighting the urge to engage in pornography, to watch or to engage physically in any kind of ill deed, to gamble, to get that financial gain regardless of whether it's going to, on the short term, do you good or otherwise, to try to prevent yourself from reaching out and picking up something that isn't yours. And that concept is central to the message of the Muslim Brotherhood. It creates a better society. But for the reasons that I mentioned, for Palestine specifically, and for the fact that they spoke loud and clear when it came to the injustices and oppressions being imparted by the Egyptian authorities of the time against ordinary Egyptians, being subservient to the colonial masters, they were a nuisance. They were a huge nuisance. And when you have that kind of following, that nuisance becomes so much amplified. So of course they needed to be demonized. So since then, stories have been fabricated, tales have been told, images have been made up, stories have been fabricated, all in order to assert that the Muslim Brothers were an evil force of society. I think that those who dig a little bit beyond the surface will recognize the fallacy of that. Once again, does that mean that none of the Muslim Brothers did anything wrong, anything that contradicts the principles? Of course, that happens in every single political gathering, social, establishment, whatever. That happens. People make mistakes. We have that since what we call as Muslims the golden generation of the companions. That happens. People make mistakes. But that doesn't cloud the whole movement. The fact that there were, I'll venture a guess and say, thousands of Catholic priests who engage in the most despicable acts does not mean that that is the status of every Catholic or anyone who, abides by Catholicism. Of course not. That would be crazy. The fact that a British person can commit a heinous crime somewhere does not cloud everyone who's British. I mean, that's common sense. But why is it then that when we come to, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood, but not only the Muslim Brotherhood, and we find an example of someone who has committed something or has gone into a particular direction that clearly is against the basic notions of the Muslim Brotherhood, all of a sudden the whole Muslim Brotherhood becomes ill. Let me give you an example of this. We're often told that the likes of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the like were impacted by the writings of Sayyid Qutb,
who was ideologue of the Muslim
who is
Brotherhood.
one of the foremost thinkers of the Muslim Brotherhood during the 50s and until his execution during the times of Nasser in 65. And he wrote some of the most important intellectual writings. Now, you could disagree about the writings, that's absolutely fine. I mean, again, they're a human endeavor. So you don't need to, there's nothing that says you must subscribe to this. There's nothing that says this. But then we, like I said, we hear that this leader of Al-Qaeda, this figure, was impacted by Sayyid Qutb. First of all, I mean, one of the most important figures during my time over the course of the past 30 years was Ayman al-Zawahiri. Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's the second in command to Osama bin Laden. And this is always said of Ayman al-Zawahiri, that he was impacted by Sayyid Qutb. Now, as far as I recall, I do not remember a single quote of Ayman al-Zawahiri where he referred back to Sayyid Qutb. I don't remember a single quote. So that kind of assumption that he was impacted by, and therefore he went on this murderous trek, is something that I would definitely bring into question. The other thing is, there are, I would suggest, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, probably even more, since the appearance of those writings in the 50s and 60s till now, who have read those writings. Yet we can quote one person, two people, 10 people, 100 people who understood from the writings that they ought to go out and kill and maim and blow up. So what about the rest of the hundreds of millions? Why is it that, for instance, my readings of Sayyid Qutb brought me to understand even more firmly the peaceful nature of what we call da'wah, the invitation to Islam? That we must never, ever, ever compel people either by force or emotionally to accept a particular message or a way of life. Never, ever. And that Islam is anything but exclusive or, exceptionist. And that it drives people to benefit from others, to learn from others, to engage with others. Why is it that I understood this, and then I'm told that someone who has chosen the caves of Afghanistan as a refuge, who has understood that he is on this sacred mission to kill and maim, why is his point of view taken, but mine is dismissed? In fact, mine stands, in terms of numbers at least, stands to be proven correct. So what's important to note, that once again, we must understand ideas as they were written, not how people understood them, inferred from them, and then brought them to life through certain activities or interpretations. I mean, coming back to the concept of this internal, external violence, when you are in a state of self-defense, and Palestine was constantly in a state of self-defense, international law says that they're allowed to resist through whatever means. That's not me speaking. That's not Hassan al-Banna speaking. That's not, this government or that. This is international law. If we here in the UK, if we were invaded by a foreign force, Russia, whoever, you can name, North Korea, I don't know. I mean, I would hope that most people would find it within themselves to take up arms in order to defend themselves, to defend their property, to defend the country, if that power was so driven to do so much evil and ill to the country. So why is it that all of a sudden the Muslim Brothers, or anyone else for that matter, defending Palestine against an occupying force that is now being recognized as being an occupying force, now 77 years on, why is that such a horrible prospect? Why is that something that is so unimaginably inhumane that, we are clouding, we are judging an entire nation, to be honest, a huge nation, one of the hugest nations that we have today, with that kind of slur, with that kind of accusation. I find it totally unreasonable from our modern modes of thinking and addressing certain issues.
Okay, so I mean, we haven't really addressed the thing that I mentioned, which is, and I mean, I'm going to build on it before you address it, because as the Muslim Brotherhood grows its chapters, and they often manifest themselves as political parties in various countries in the Muslim world, but as it grows its chapters, it goes into non-Muslim societies in the West, and it entrenches itself as political parties or other civil society sort of vehicles in mainly in the Arab world, in sort of under authoritarian governments, right? How do both of these two things? But let's first deal with in the Arab world. How does that influence the growth and the nature of what the Muslim Brotherhood becomes, its vehicles, and does that eventually? Because when we see the Arab Spring happening 15 years ago, the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia, in Egypt, in other parts where we didn't get flung into civil war, became massive civil society actors, became at times the leading opposition movements. In the case of Egypt and in Tunisia, they headed the government at some point. So how does that happen, and do they become a force for democratization against these dictators? Like, what's the evolution like?
The development, the growth of the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of vehicles, and I like the way that you framed this, in various countries, that just happened naturally. It was done organically. One of the most important pillars of Islamic education in probably the Muslim world, but I'm going to restrict it to the Arab world, is Al-Azhar University. Graduates of Al-Azhar University are renowned for, and it doesn't just teach Islamic sciences, but it also teaches applied sciences. So, but it's one of the most revered, with an incredible legacy in history. And many students from across the world, particularly the Muslim world, came to Egypt to study at Al-Azhar University, to study law, politics, Islamic studies, Arabic language. And being there, Hassan al-Banna, the Muslim Brothers, were there, and they were holding their weekly meetings, public meetings. And these people got to hear the message.
And these were like, there were meetings where people were being, what was happening? Political meetings?
No. I mean, the meetings were essentially spiritual to educational, probably semi-intellectual. I wouldn't even label them as being intellectual. But those kinds of meetings, and they were public, they were open, often done in Al-Azhar, sometimes done in various other places, sometimes in the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was labeled, it was open, it was there, it was. And when they finished their studies and headed back home, they thought this is a message that could do a lot of good. And they established their chapters. So it wasn't something that, the Muslim Brothers in Egypt didn't
it wasn't like the Communist Party
emissaries,
out of Russia,
saying that we're going to establish a chapter here or there. On many occasions, the Egyptians wouldn't even know that there was a chapter calling themselves Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin in a particular country. I know from what my father tells me that in Iraq, the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood came into being in the early 50s when the founder or the first main figure of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sheikh Mahmoud al-Sawaf, had finished his studies in Al-Azhar, had met with Hassan al-Banna. He came back and he went up and down the country, telling people about this message and attracting people to join. It was that easy. There wasn't any kind of conditions, strenuous kind of bureaucracy in order to join. It was just, okay, sign me up. And that was essentially how it spread. And all of a sudden, you had chapters in India before the partition. You had chapters in Central Asia. You had chapters in the Gulf countries, the GCC. You had, people just basically visited Egypt, heard the message, met the people concerned, whether it be Hassan al-Banna or those who came after, and then decided to apply the message to their own contexts. And you then jump to the Arab Spring. Now, the Arab Spring is probably, I would suggest, one of the most important landmarks historically, not only to the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way. In fact, I would suggest I would even go as far as to say that it's one of the most important advents in modern history. I believe that if history was to be written justly, that in 100 years' time, history students at school level would study that in 2010, 2011, there was a monumentous social movement that created incredible changes. Whether successful or otherwise, they could, discuss that. But so I think that, and what's important, and this is something that needs to be asserted. The Muslim Brotherhood didn't call for the Arab Spring. They weren't even at the forefront of the Arab Spring, neither in Tunis or in Egypt or anywhere else. They were not. And therefore, sometimes when people speak of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Arab Spring as though they're somehow interlinked, I don't know whether that's sometimes in order to, claim credit where credit is undue, or whether it's to slur and lambast and attack or critique. It's not clear to me, but what needs to be told historically is that the Muslim Brotherhood were not at the forefront of the Arab Spring. In fact, if you were to read the documents of those who wrote about the Arab Spring, who were there, whether Muslim Brothers or otherwise, you would realize that the Muslim Brothers were late to the show. In fact, people, they speak about the 21st of January. That was when people congregated in Maidan al-Tahrir and they started calling, first of all, for the reform of the regime, and then it transferred quickly to the fall of the regime. It is well documented that the Muslim Brothers at the beginning, they decided not to have anything to do with this. And they regarded this as a popular movement of suspicious intent. I was one of those people who contacted my friends in Egypt, whom I knew at the time, and I said, "What are you doing? This is historic. This is incredible. Why are you sitting in your offices and at home? People are on the streets. Why aren't you there? This is your time. Everything that you've called for. Everything that you've called for. This is your moment. And it took them 3-4 days. It's known that the Muslim Brothers, at first, because they realized the immense pressure they were under, so they allowed the students and their youth to go and join those hordes, but without carrying any banners representing the Muslim Brotherhood. Go there as individuals. Go there as student unions, but don't go there as the Muslim Brotherhood. We're not being part of this. This was around the 22nd or 23rd of January. It was only when the pressure became unsustainable from within, the youth themselves were telling the leaders, what are you doing? Everyone's out here. You're the only ones who are not. That by the 25th, the Muslim Brothers decided that they were going to join the crowd. So I think that claim that the Arab Spring was somehow initiated or organized or orchestrated or engineered, all those terms, by the Muslim Brothers, that needs to be laid to rest. But then, like I said, they are the biggest civil society in the world, my claim is. And you can argue with that, but that's my claim. And therefore, they have the biggest and most impactful organizational potential. They very quickly, as soon as the Muslim brothers descended on Maidan al-Tahrir, immediately they organized themselves so that there were thousands of their young who were mobilized to secure the entrances, the various entrance points to Maidan al-Tahrir, to make sure that it can't be infiltrated either by the army or by any other factions that are pro-Mubarak. And they then immediately set up tents for medical aid, for educational aids for those who brought their children and didn't send them to school, food tents, all of that. That was organized by the Muslim Brothers because that's what they do. That is their potential. And when the time came and the armed forces had to negotiate with the protesters, they realized that the biggest element, the most important element, the biggest element that can organize people was the Muslim Brotherhood, and therefore they negotiated with them as well as with others, of course, but mostly with the Muslim Brothers. And then when election time came, and you have to, I mean, something you mentioned, Ashfaq, and I think it's important to point to this, and you used the word democratization. When the word democratization was used more than at any other time in our lifetimes, it was used around the Iraq wartime in 2003. I remember then the State Secretary Condoleezza Rice. Every other line, she would speak about democratizing the Middle East. She would talk about democratizing Iraq, which would then become a beacon of democracy, and everyone would want to join that particular club. Have you noticed that in the past 10, 15 years, we've never ever heard that word being uttered? Never. Why? Going back to Hosni Mubarak, I remember in Colin Powell's memoirs, he mentioned a meeting where he was dispatched to Egypt to meet with President Mubarak at the time. This was probably around 2008, 2009. And one of the things he said, maybe hold elections, maybe a little bit more democracy, maybe soften the pressure on those dissidents. And he mentions that Mubarak stopped him in his tracks and said, hang on, you sure about this? Because if we are to have democracy, if we are going to have elections, then you need to contend yourself with the Muslim Brothers coming to rule. And he said that was the end of the meeting. Unfortunately, Hosni Mubarak knew exactly what the situation was, and knew that in a free and fair elections, that the Muslim Brothers would come as winners. During those times, and therefore there was never, ever, before 2011, there was never, ever an incident where there were free elections, fair elections in the case of Egypt. Sometimes on the level of students' unions or trade unions, but never else. When the Arab Spring happened, when Mubarak fell, and I'm not going to say the regime changed because it didn't, but when Mubarak fell, during those from, let's say, February 2011 till about May, June 2013. So we're talking about just over 2 years.
Months,
yeah. We had 5 rounds of elections. Free, fair, observed by people from around the world, and attested as free and fair. The only time that Egypt had a civil administration, a civil government that implemented and took out an election that was free and fair. The turnout was often over 70%, which you and I know in modern world is incredibly high. I mean, if, high turnouts in the UK, for instance, is about 60%. So we were often having 70, sometimes 77, 78% turnout. And every single one was won by the Muslim Brothers. And hence the problem that the West, the UK, the US, France has with democracy. So talking about democratization is one thing, but actually implementing democracy is a total different thing. And by the way, even before the Arab Spring, there was a sad incident that was brought about by democracy.
In Gaza.
In Gaza, in Palestine. Where we had, as attested by the former US President Carter himself, one of the freest and fairest elections ever, and which was won by Hamas. And immediately the world made sure to punish the Palestinian people for ever choosing or ticking next to the name of Hamas. They were absolutely, I remember being on one of the British media, whether it be Sky or Channel 4, can't remember now, before the elections. And my co-panelist was saying that it's extremely likely that it's going to be the PLO that will rule the elections. And when I suggested that let's wait and see, and that might not be the case, he essentially, literally, he laughed me off. He said, come on, Anas, come on. Okay, fine. You have your preferences probably, but let's be reasonable here. So when the results come out and they've won almost 2/3 of the vote, that was a shock to the world. And since then, a siege like never, nothing that we've ever experienced, was laid upon Gaza. And we come to today where we're still in the midst of a genocide being perpetrated against the people of Gaza, all because of that choice, that democratic choice they made in 2006. So it's a nice idea. Just like when Gandhi was asked about what he thought about Western democracy, he said it's a lovely idea. It's a notion, it's a dream, it's a wish in the minds of some, but when the outcome is not according to the expectation or the desire, then you're going to see brutality, you're going to see oppression, you're going to see violence and killing like you've never ever witnessed in your entire life. And we've seen this time and time and time again. So again, in regards with the Muslim Brothers, coming back to the Muslim Brothers, it's not only the non-violence principle of the Muslim Brotherhood that they abide by come what may, but it's also the fact that any kind of change has to go through peaceful, let's term it, democratic channels. Call them whatever those democratic channels are. You can call them shura in some places, you can call them whatever, lujurga, for instance, in some places, you can call them democracy in other places. But they do it right, they do it proper, they do not deceive, they do not cheat, they do not carry out coups, despite the fact that they have the numbers to do so. But they never do that. There is never, ever an incident in that tumultuous world, that region, from Morocco all the way to Indonesia. There is not a single area where either the Muslim Brothers or whatever mode or vehicle or political party that believes in the message has ever done a military coup or a coup of any kind of nature and overtaken power by force and despite the wills of the people. I think there's a combination of history being faked, we're presented. I mean, it's, Ashfaq, when we look at the past 2.5 years almost now, 2 years, 3 months, and what's been going on in Gaza, and the performance of the world media, and those who are regarded as intellectuals and thinkers and, commentators, and the kind of what the world came to recognize as utter nonsense in terms of the commentary and in terms of presenting truth. I think it's suffice to say that we really mustn't take things at face value. And we really mustn't, take what some doctor or professor or political leader, says into a microphone. I think we should be a little bit more discerning. And the fact is that we live in very, very odd times. And the more we realize how odd and awkward and sometimes vile these times are, the more understanding I think we'll have not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but of social movements, reform movements around the world, whether they be Muslim or otherwise. The fact that we, and you particularly, because you are in this world, that you see the crime being committed. You see the child being killed. You see the house being destroyed. You see the hospital being brought down. And with it, the commentary comes that, no, this is a lie. You're seeing it, but immediately someone important, of a political, academic, whatever nature, tells you, no, you're not seeing it. It's not true. And more likely, as we saw in the United Nations across the world, the analyst, the commentator who is telling you that you're not seeing what you're seeing is supported. These are, very, very odd times. But unfortunately, that's the kind of time that we have to endure.
Okay, I wanna start speaking about Trump and why he's sort of isolated Egypt, which is interesting because since Sisi has taken power, he's basically locked up or decimated, and many people are affiliated to a vehicle of the Muslim Brotherhood have kind of exiled themselves, and Lebanon and Jordan. But before we go there, just kind of explain how the Muslim Brotherhood have operated outside of what we've spoken about already. Egypt, I guess we'll speak about Tunisia because that's a bit of a different case. And Palestine, where they have where we mentioned the Hamas winning the elections, but just because for example in Kuwait and in Jordan they've been part of the parliamentary processes for decades. Other countries as well. In Iraq, your father is the head of the party that manifests. That's a manifestation of the Muslim Brotherhood. So just how the Muslim Brotherhood has come to be, and I mean broadly speaking, you can go country by country, however you think is the best way to break it down, but just how they've come to manifest themselves as a political reality, often working in the constraints of an Arab dictatorship, or sometimes against, or sometimes in the shadows. Just break that down a bit for us.
The Muslim Brotherhood, like I said, I mean, the closest description that I could give them is that they are a civil society. And they have many manifestations due to the very principles that I started off with, that kind of comprehensive, universal look at Islam and how it must engage in terms of its collection of values with everything that you do, whether you're an artist, whether you're a sports person, whether you're a politician, whether you're a financier, someone who works with banks or insurance companies, and every single country has a different set of circumstances. For instance, I mean, one of the things quite interesting, a few months ago only, and after the battering that the Sisi military regime has delivered to the Muslim Brotherhood. And it is a huge, incredible battery. They have about 60,000 prisoners since 2013 now. I mean, over 10 years, lingering in prison, many of them in horrendous conditions. Many actually have passed away due to ill treatment, including the former only civil elected president of Egypt. Yet one of the government officials was saying that today, if we have an election, the Muslim Brotherhood will win. And I found that absurd, because I don't think it to be true, firstly. I mean, personally, I don't think it to be true. But the fact that this person can come after 12 years of this absolute crackdown, call it decimation, call it whatever you want, of the Muslim Brothers, can still come out and say that if we had an election today, the Muslim Brotherhood might win, is in itself telling. It's telling of this fear, and I have no doubt that this official was sending a warning to the entire world. Stop telling us to be more observing of human rights. Stop, because if we do so, they will come out and they will win and they will rule Egypt. That's a message. That's a message. But on the other hand, you also need to understand that the Muslim Brotherhood, through their principles, through their work, and by the way, none of this was clandestine, they managed to create an incredible, vast infrastructure of schools, of children creches and nurseries, of hospitals and clinics, of education center where children with certain needs would be supported, charitable organizations. An incredible, that the state of Egypt realizes absolutely, fully, 100% that it cannot survive without. The vast majority of Egyptians live either around the poverty line, either just above or below the poverty line. And we're talking about tens of millions of people. Those tens of millions of people, the state has no means of sustaining. It has no means of supporting. It has no means within its corrupt economic policies or failed political policies to sustain. And it realized that those are only sustained and kept quiet against revolting against their status quo by the infrastructure that provides them with often free services, medical, educational, social, all sorts of services you can imagine. And therefore, the state, whilst battering the Muslim Brotherhood, realizes it can't do without them. Now, that is in Egypt. The situation is very, very similar wherever you go, whether it be Algeria, whether it be Morocco, whether it be Tunisia, whether it be Sudan, whether it be Somalia, whether it be Bangladesh, whether it be any country that you can think of. It's very, very similar. The Muslim Brothers are dedicated to reforming and bettering their societies in terms of their livelihoods, way before thinking about changing the political system, about throwing out the current and bringing in a new system which they may be at the helm of. It's that kind of perspective that needs to be understood. These are people who are dedicated. You're talking about doctors, engineers, you're talking about specialists in physiotherapy, you're talking about educational psychologists, you're talking about who would do their shifts, do their 10, 12-hour shifts, and then go and spend another 3-4 hours in those private practices, those charitable organizations, those, clubs or societies where they get to meet young people and offer them services that they know they wouldn't be able to afford, during daytime hours. These are people, how do you control such a person who isn't bound by the 9 to 5 job where at the end of the month you get a paycheck, but have a greater yearning, who feel that, going to work and doing a 10-hour shift isn't enough and that you can definitely sustain doing another 4, 5, 6 hours. And that if you don't, you feel that kind of burden of guilt. So you go out and you do. You know, how do you control such a person? How do you tell them you mustn't raise your voice? You mustn't speak truth to power. How do you control them? And therefore, when you go around, I mean, and you can list the countries, you know, every single country, you will find. And by the way, you know, one of the terms that the media here in the UK, for instance, and I'm pretty sure the West, generally speaking, maybe we'll talk about this a little, spoke of over the course of the past decade, particularly after the Arab Spring, when not only the Egyptian regime, but any other Arab regime that was scared heckless about change coming to them and wanting to absolutely forbid any kind of potential or possibility that anything like this could ever happen again. So when, you know, GCC countries with immense wealth started buying off our media establishments and media organizations, as well as PR companies or whatever you have, the notion that was used was the global network of the Muslim Brotherhood, the global network. There is no such global network. What there is that people who believe in the central idea, the simplicity of the idea, the basics of Islam. This is not, by the way, this is not a new religion. This is not an unknown, unheard of. I mean, every single parameter, every single basic that was laid down by Hassan al-Banna was supported by a Quran, a verse from the Quran or from the Hadith. It's very, very simple. Very, very simple. Very easy, very basic. It's nothing that requires a particular degree. It's nothing that requires a particular capacity, mental or otherwise, in order to understand. And that's the brilliance of the idea. That's the absolute brilliance of the idea. So whether you be someone who lives in Indonesia and doesn't speak a word of Arabic, or whether you be someone from Morocco and doesn't understand a word of Indonesian, but the kind of sense of responsibility, social before anything else, whether political or economic, is almost the same. And that is that kind of duty towards not only yourself, but also those around you, and to reforming and bettering and improving societies. That kind of message is incredibly powerful. I would suggest that the Muslim Brothers in various countries, they appear and manifest in the network of schools that are usually outstanding, or the network of clinics and hospitals that are usually quite outstanding and outperform anything that the state can perform. By the way, a very interesting debate that I became involved in many years ago, probably 20, 25 years ago, and in one Arab country that I won't mention, but the question that some people posed was this. They said, you know, the Muslim Brothers there, they provide an educational infrastructure, a health and medical care infrastructure, a social support system for domestic abuse, for violence, wherever, rifts between parents and children, between husband and wife, a media infrastructure. And in a sense, that incredible work is somehow you're doing the job of the state. So in a way, and this was the argument that was posed, this is a failed government. The regime is a failed regime. They don't have a clue. They don't know how to run the country. And if they were left to their own means, they would collapse within a matter of weeks. But we're sustaining them. We're providing the support that they should be providing. Why is it that the Muslim Brothers are feeding 50,000 families? Why? Why is the Muslim Brothers, why are they helping with the education of about 250,000 students every single day? Why? For nothing. For free. Why? You're doing it and benefiting the corrupt state that should be exposed as the failed corrupt state that it is. That was an argument. And I remember at the time that very clearly people said, we can't afford to let people suffer. We know that if we halted all these services, the government would have no way of sustaining, but who's going to pay the price at the end? Probably, yeah, the government will collapse, the state will fall, but then you'll have millions of people who will suffer and not know how to provide those services or sustain themselves. That level of thinking, just so you realize that whilst, yes, of course, there are political ambitions. People talk about, well, the Muslim Brothers, they want to get to government. So what? Isn't that the nature of democracy? I mean, so what if they contest elections and want to win? What if they provide quite organized, disciplined campaigns that convince the majority that they are the best for the job? So what? So what? I mean, why is that such a slur? Why is that such this kind of puritanical view that, no, you should do without wanting any kind of, well, what kind of world are we living in? What kind of, it's just ridiculous. But unfortunately, that's part of the argument that we're having. Coming back to what I feel is the problem today. And I want to talk about the executive order, by the way, because that's quite a telling thing. But coming back to where we are, I think that Gaza exposed something quite important and exposed it to the whole world. It exposed that we are truly, and I speak about everyone, we as members of this human society, we are in this battle at the very, very center of a battle ongoing between truth and fabrication, truth and falsehood. Whether it be on the level of the media, whether it be in terms of politics, whether it be in terms of our economics and finances, whether it be in terms of our social existence. Everything seems, and now that we've literally entered the age of AI, we literally cannot tell truth from falsehood. But I'm talking more about metaphorically rather than actually. But now we are there where we simply cannot tell the difference between what is right and what is wrong. And it seems to me that there is this deliberate attempt in order to bamboozle us, in order to confuse us. Someone who's confused cannot find their bearings, doesn't know right from left, doesn't know right from wrong, cannot make assertive decisions. You cannot plan for yourself. You cannot think ahead. And it seems that most people today are left in that position. It's it's far easier. As a dear friend of mine recently told me, he said, it just gets too much, consuming news. I just have to go to TikTok and just go through my feed and listen to these music clips and watch people do silly things. And it just, and that is the desire. Bingo. That's exactly what's required. Leave everything aside. Don't worry yourself. Don't worry yourself. Leave it to those who know. There are people there who have bigger minds than you, who have bigger qualifications than yourself. It's their response. That's what they're being paid for. Don't you think? Don't think. Just watch, enjoy, and purchase. That's where we are today. We are consumers. We are consumers. But the moment you start thinking that your set of values propel you to do anything in life to reform it, to change it, yeah, maybe change the days in which your bins are collected. Maybe. But anything more than that, and you'll find yourself facing a barrage of ridicule, a barrage of accusation, a barrage of suspicion, a barrage of attack. Try it. See it for yourself. We had in the UK, we had the episode of Jeremy Corbyn, which was exposed by many, including Al Jazeera, as to what kind of incredible acrimony as a result of his stance. Jeremy is a dear friend of mine, and someone I'm extremely proud to call a brother. He has some wonderful principles, but in my view, he wasn't going to be prime minister. I don't think he was ever going to be prime minister. Not because there was a plot to depose him, but because I don't think that Labour, as a party, had it within them to win the elections in 2017 or 2019. So I don't think, but still, he needed not only to be deposed, but he needed to be deposed with an incredible tar on his reputation, his legacy. You know, one of the first people who stood in defense of minorities, including Jews, when it was totally unfashionable, being accused of being an anti-Semitic. It's utterly ridiculous. But there we have it. So the fact is that we are in this existential battle, existential struggle as individuals to create the kind of world that we dream of. You know, the kind of world that back in the day, I remember there being a very, very brief moment of time, especially when Labour came after, 13 years of conservative rule, when Tony Blair came, and all of a sudden we were talking about, multiculturalism. We were talking about being a rich society. I remember once hearing a speech where the mayor of London spoke about London being the city where every single language in the entire world was spoken, where every single faith in the entire religion was practiced, where every single ethnicity in the entire world was present. That used to be a cause for celebration, but it was a very, very brief time. And then all of a sudden we're now back where the whole notion of living with or seen to be close to someone from a different race or a different religion is seen as a problem. And that's being perpetuated. So the fact that today there are people who can afford to dream, who can afford to present a picture of what could be, and not could be with a lot of struggle and suffering, but could be quite easily because it fits with our natural, intrinsic, organic, instinctive human nature. So it's not something that requires, let's think about the next generation or the generation after that. Let's start from school level and then no. It's something that could happen with a click of a button. But because there is such a climate of fear, a climate of judgment and accusation, a climate that this is the best you'll get. And therefore, to be perfectly honest, I mean, whilst today the headlines are about the Muslim Brotherhood, but to be honest, it's not about the Muslim Brotherhood. Remember the time when 9/11 happened and all of a sudden we were talking about terrorism and terrorists. And we couldn't tell who was meant. I mean, you needed to start every sentence you said by saying, I condemn terrorism. It was ridiculous. It was absurd. It was demeaning. It was humiliating. And it didn't matter whether in your entire life, whether you've even held, a sharp object. It didn't matter. But the accusation was there. And the first thing you needed to do was to disavow yourself of any kind of link to terrorism. The notion was incredible. And we still have it today, where if someone was to do something criminal or crazy, I would have to stand up and say, I condemn. Otherwise, I would be seen as an associate. That is an unreasonable state of affairs, but it's the state of affairs that we have today. So the talk about the Muslim Brotherhood is just another bogeyman title, because what's going to happen, and if I may come to Trump's, there's no Muslim Brotherhood HQ in London or in Paris or in Washington or in Berlin. There's no Muslim Brotherhood, in fact, I would suggest, beyond the Arab world. There is no Muslim Brotherhood in many Arab countries. They've been disbarred. So there are individuals who believe in the idea, because like I said, I believe that most people, even though they might claim that they are enemies or adversaries or opponents or objectors to the Muslim Brotherhood, but they carry a very similar notion. So what exactly is it that is the problem here? The Muslim Brotherhood, when being labeled in the way that they are by President Trump, it's, again, just like terrorists, just like extremists, just like radical. It means nothing, but it potentially involves everyone. A charity organization. Well, we don't know, but maybe about 30 years ago, you invited someone who is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. Oh, you in your mosque, someone whose cousin was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in some faraway land. This organization, you presented an academic paper where you supported the Muslim Brothers in Egypt when they came to power democratically. So all of a sudden, we're going through the same game, the same trick. We're going through the very same mill as what we did after 9/11. You'll have to disavow, claim from the very start, albeit that you could be on a TV show talking about the latest fashion, and you'll have to start by saying, oh, by the way, I hate the Muslim Brothers, I condemn them, I see them as a scourge on humanity, before you then are allowed to present yourself as a human being. That's, how grave that is, how dangerous that situation. So my contention is that this decision, regardless of the details, it targets Islam's presence in the West. It targets Islam's infrastructure in the West. It targets Islamic civil society work. It targets Islamic schools. It targets Islamic mosques, da'wah centers. It targets libraries. It targets physicians. It targets everyone. Unless the first thing you say, I hate the Muslim Brothers, I'm not one of them. If I have a brother or a cousin or a distant uncle who I disavow them, I don't talk to them, I don't send them gifts during Eid. Unless you do that, you'll be under that kind of cloud of suspicion. Now that's one thing. The other thing is, in regard with the executive order, there are a number of things that need to be said. The first is that it's a very, very cheap way of getting what they wanted. Very, very cheap. And, when we're having this discussion, we disagree. We disagree so much that I feel that I'm not getting my point through. I'm not winning. What do? I cancel you. All of a sudden, I'm saying, hang on, Ashfaq, you have this distant relative who does this and this and this, and all of a sudden it's not about the argument, it's about you. And then to stop you from talking, to remove you from being on this chair, I say, well, you know what, I feel intimidated by you, by the way. I feel threatened by you. So no, you need to be cancelled, you need to be arrested, you need to be... It's a coward's way out. If you can't win an ideological, intellectual argument, and you then resort to using your authority and influence to cancelling that person so that you don't hear them anymore. It's like listening to the radio, and rather than engaging in a discussion, what you do is you switch off the radio. You don't want to, because you can only suffer your own views. You can only stand to hear your own voice. You can't manage, you can't win when there is a stronger argument in the room. Secondly, an executive order, for those who don't know, is the cheap way out of getting a law passed. Basically, there was a will. There were millions and millions and millions of dollars spent by regimes such as the United Arab Emirates and probably Saudi Arabia, I'm not sure, but definitely the United Arab Emirates, on lobbyists and on congressmen and women, so that they support this bill and enshrine it in law. So it becomes law. Okay? But such was the rush and the haste to get this somehow through, because there are contracts on the table. There are billions and billions and probably even trillions of dollars on the table, to be either rescinded or to be captured, So something quick needed to happen. And we can't really wait for Congress to do its job. And probably even after those tens of millions of dollars spent on those to buy their positions, we're not entirely sure that it'll pass, because in the past it didn't. So let's sign an executive order. An executive order is the cheap steak way out, because an executive order can be rescinded by another executive order. So it just takes the change of president or the president himself to just say, well, you know what, I don't like this law anymore. Whilst if it was enshrined in law, you would need Congress in its entirety to repeal the law, or for the Supreme Court to adjudge against it. And that's way, way too difficult. So do what? Let's do the executive order. So that's one thing about the order itself. The second is, rather than achieve what these countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, probably Jordan, wanted, he only selected 3 countries. And that's quite telling from a number of points of view. The first is that I contend or argue that he probably couldn't, because the Muslim Brothers are part and parcel of society. I mean, only until a few weeks ago, they were parts of parliament in Kuwait. They were part of the Jordanian parliament. So, what are you going to do with those countries whom you regard as allies? What do? Do you sanction the country? Do you impose some sort of embargo? Do you what? What do you do? And plus, these are the countries that surround Israel. What Trump has announced to the world, that the biggest and most important step to defend Israel and its occupation and its expansionist project is by banning the Muslim Brotherhood. All of a sudden, Trump has become the biggest cheerleader for the Muslim Brothers, telling the world it was them that were standing in the face of Israeli aggression and oppression and expansion. And that, to me, in the climate that we have today, is the biggest sort of accreditation and recommendation that the Muslim Brothers could ever get, without even, lifting a finger, whilst being in prison, whilst being battered, whilst being oppressed, whilst being killed. So it's quite interesting what has happened. I think that countries like the UAE are frustrated to their bone. I think that many people out there that were hoping for this global banning and proscription and designation of the Muslim Brotherhood, I believe that they are extremely angry and very, very frustrated. And the thing is that these countries, the UAE decided back in 2014, 11 years ago, that the Muslim Brothers were designated as a terrorist organization. And but the thing is, it realized that it was too insignificant and too unimportant and irrelevant to have that carry beyond its own borders. So for the past decade, over a decade, it's been plowing millions after millions after millions in this attempt to get any Western country, whether it be the UK, whether it be France, whether it be the United States, to simply consolidate its own decision by declaring the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Then it would say, see, we told you so. But the fact that no one is driving it up the wall and proving the point. And just like our own government, when it tried during David Cameron to do the investigation into the Muslim Brotherhood, only to be met with an incredibly important historic report by the then Foreign Affairs Select Committee that said actually political Islam, including the Muslim Brotherhood, posed a firewall, that's the term, a firewall between the young and violence or extremism. That report is there. It's on the Parliament website. But unfortunately, the media aren't really that bothered to highlight it, to bring it to the fore or to comment on it, because it is damning to those accusations that the Muslim Brotherhood is anything but a peaceful, civil, democratic, totally open, on many fronts liberal, and I use that word advisedly, Muslim organization. And in the kind of grim, bleak reality of the Arab world and the majority of the Muslim world, where there are no human rights, there are no freedoms, there are no democratic systems, you would suggest that you actually need a power and a force such as the Muslim Brotherhood in order to bring those elements into public life. But the fact is that those were always buzzwords for election campaigns and for people who wanted public donations in order to stand for office, but never meant. It's just like the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, where when speaking against Israel and accepting the case of South Africa, were told quite sternly, you were created not for us, but for the others. So the same thing with human rights, with freedoms, with rights. These were not created for for us. They were created for, the bunch of people who are okay, buying their Apple iPhones every year, changing their Nike sneakers and wearing whatever brands, consumers essentially. So yeah, we'll allow you freedoms. You can go into any supermarket. This is, by the way, something that someone once told me when we were discussing this. He said, try going into any supermarket. You have a choice of more than 30 cheeses at worst, as though that is the epitome of freedom and freedom of choice. So yeah, you have the right to choose the colors of your jumper, and you have the right to choose whether you use fuel or electricity for your vehicle, or whether it's unleaded or unleaded supreme. You have the right to choose where you go on holiday. And you have the right definitely to, select which media station you wish to hear. But try thinking. Try proposing something that isn't within the realm of what's in front of you. And see how that goes.
Okay. Could you, we don't have much more time. It's been quite a long discussion, but I want to discuss a few more things with you. So could you just tell me a bit about the specifics of the Muslim Brotherhood in Lebanon and Jordan? We've spoken a lot about Egypt already and the fact that Sisi's tried to decimate them, but not successfully. That's the one thing. And then, okay, let's discuss that and then I'll come to my question.
The Muslim Brotherhood in name are only present in Egypt. And present as in they're there. And before the coup, they had an office with the emblem. I've seen it. I've been to it. I doubt, in Jordan the same. I've also seen their office with the emblem. I've seen it in Al-Abdali, in downtown Amman. So those are the only two countries I know where the Muslim Brotherhood with that name exist. I don't know them to exist with that name anywhere else. In Syria, they haven't established anything since the fall of the Assad regime. And I don't know of anywhere else where they are called as such. The closest, and in terms, once again, of the reference, the intellectual reference points, you'll find in Lebanon there is something called the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya in Lebanon. And they are probably, arguably, the strongest Sunni, because Lebanon is a sectarian, fragmented state of politics and society. So the biggest Sunni faction in Lebanon is Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya. So you could argue that, that's the Muslim Brotherhood. But They are part and parcel of the political structure. They are part and parcel of society. I mean, this is the thing that sometimes gets me, that unfortunately we see things from an entirely Western colonial perspective. And we assume that by the virtue of Donald Trump signing his crazy signature, that things will end. So since he's now designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization in Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, they are no more. Or they can somehow be, locked away or taken out. It doesn't happen like that. The Muslim Brotherhood, due to the fact that they are a civil society with an incredible infrastructure of public services, which even the states cannot provide, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. When there was an actual witch hunt after the coup d'etat in Egypt, after the Rab'a massacre in August of 2013, there was an actual witch hunt where the state police would go door to door. And this was something that was, I think, written in one of our papers, whether The Independent or Guardian, I can't remember. But it was written, and it was quite incredible just reading it, because this journalist was going with the State Department and, going behind them, seeing what's happening and how people are reacting. So on one occasion, an old lady who apparently was just scared to her bits about, the sight of this, whole team of heavily armed state police officers, attacking the very narrow street that she was sat in, shouted at them and pointed to one of the apartments above. And she said, they are Muslim brothers. And one of the officers said, "How do you know?" And what she said was incredible. This was quoted. What she said was, "Because they give me $100 every month." I would assume that this old lady was just scared, was just absolutely mortified, terrified. And she just came up with this, this way to defend herself, to wave off and to show herself to be loyal to the state. And the only thing that she could accuse the people she was pointing to, that because they helped her with $100 every month. You can't remove the Muslim Brotherhood from society. And if you can remove them in terms of their infrastructure, their organizations, you will not be able to remove the thought. And this is something we've said all along, for decades, Ashfaq. The sure way to lose a battle with ideas is to fight them with violence. That's a sure way to lose that battle. You fight ideas with ideas. You become cleverer. You become more inventive, more creative. You perform better. You implement better. That's how you defeat ideas. You show the other idea to be of less value. But this absolutist, this zero-sum game does not work, because in the minds of many, what you're doing is, and just like I said in regards with why Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt, why those countries that are surrounding Israel, just like that, you are glorifying, you are magnifying the impact. You are recommending it to those who are frustrated with their states of living. So you are glorifying the idea rather than the sure way to get a book to sell copies beyond the wildest imagination of the author, ban it. That's the best way. The sure way, and this according to many folklore, jokes everywhere that I've heard in the Arab world and beyond, you want to get a piece of news out, tell your wife and tell her that's a big secret. It's a running joke. It's probably a despicable joke, but it just goes to show that through things like this, through banning, proscribing, you have glorified the idea. You have now people around the world who probably never ever heard of the Muslim Brothers are now searching, to read through the books and the writings, and why is it that these people are so dangerous? Why is it that they're seen, in the midst of one of the gravest times in living memory, where we have, starting with our home, this planet is in danger, to the economic failures of every single government I can recall, where we have less than 1% enjoying numbers that we can't even calculate. Billions. The other day, that story about Elon Musk given 10 years and $1 trillion. We're now talking in trillions of dollars. Trump goes to Qatar and to Saudi Arabia and comes back with trillions of dollars. We're not talking about billions anymore. I remember that film, comedy, Powers, Austin Powers. And when, this guy who wakes up after 50 years, this villain wakes up and then he holds something to ransom and then he demands $1 million. Things have moved on and everyone's saying, what? Just $1 million? Now $1 billion is that. $1 billion is nothing. You have less than 1% having those incredible amounts of money whilst about 90% of human population suffering. Where you have here in the UK, one of the G20 countries, one of the highest GDPs in the entire world, where you have people struggling. When COVID hit and people were locked in their homes and didn't go to work before the furlough, what happened was, after one single month, millions of Brits, considering themselves well off, considering themselves, living comfortably, having good jobs, after one single missed paycheck, started to say, hang on a second, we can't sustain this. It wasn't after a year, it wasn't after 2 years, it was after one single month. That is a society that is in need. Even those who are in jobs, because once they lose their jobs, within a matter of weeks, they are going to start suffering. We have the biggest and most thriving industry is that of food banks here in the UK. We have homelessness. We have issues like you would never believe. Imagine the entire population of Lebanon, that country that we've just spoken of, that entire population of Lebanon sleeps on the streets in America every single day, even sub-zero temperatures. Now you have those issues, and then all of a sudden you have the president issuing an executive order banning or proscribing or designating the Muslim Brotherhood. What? What has happened recently? What has happened recently? What kind of attack has there been recently where the Muslim Brotherhood are implicated or they've claimed responsibility that now requires me to designate them as a terrorist organization? What is the cause? I have these calamities surrounding me. I have governments. Every single government that I can mention is a failed government politically, economically, socially, security-wise. Our biggest problem, all our failures of successive governments here in the UK are thrown about with one reason, and that is immigration. That's it. Immigrants. Those penniless, homeless people coming, trying to find refuge, safety, sanctity from wars and from economic failures that we have propelled, we have promoted in their countries. Those are the reason why we have problems? Really? But those who are rewarded with billions and billions and billions of dollars in commissions, in bonuses, they're not? Somehow, as someone said, somehow they've tricked poor people to think that the reason why they're poor are the poor people that are arriving at their shores. This is ridiculous to a degree that is very difficult to quantify. And unless we come up with a different solution, unless we come up with something else, unless we start saying enough is enough, because what's at stake here is our humanity. The issue, when I described a little bit earlier, this struggle between truth and falsehood, what's at stake is not truth, it's our humanity. When you start seeing the burning alive of children, and then you deny it, or you try to justify it, or you try to explain it, you've lost a bit of your humanity. And what we stand to lose today is that we stand to lose our collective humanity. There's a problem, but you know what? It's not me. Look over here. It's that problem. It's them people. It's that. Be afraid. Ashfaq, be afraid. Be afraid. Because when you're afraid, insurance companies boost their sales. Those who manufacture the metal detecting machines at airports and the such that have us go through this undignified striptease every time we want to go and visit our families and come back home safely. You know, they get to win. When we're afraid, that's what happens. You can, if you dare protest against why it's taking so long for these measures, for these searches, for these whatever it is, someone could be threatening your safety, your life. You should be afraid. Be afraid. Be afraid. And that's the message. So be afraid. And now, be afraid of the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brotherhood is the source of your problem. There hasn't been, in my recollection, a coup, revolution, an attack carried out or claimed responsibility by the Muslim Brothers since, you know, the Arab Spring, which again I say it wasn't perpetrated by the Muslim Brothers. But yet, the problem is, our whole problem is the Muslim Brothers. It's ridiculous.
Final question, and it's been a long conversation, but I mean, I guess there's been a bunch of people who have heard this conversation that we've just had and would be quite intrigued. And I mean, we've spoken a lot about sort of global power and how there's a weeding out of you know, democracy movements in the Middle East, and sort of the duplicity of how Western power and capital works. But there may still not be people who could fully understand just what exactly the Muslim Brotherhood would represent in you know, if they were living in their society. So let's assume there was a political party in the UK that was, you know, a manifestation of the Muslim Brotherhood. Describe what that political party would be. What would be its stances and the current issues we're facing? Give us a sense of what that would mean.
I don't know. I don't know. I know what the message is. Now, any group can claim to be the Muslim Brotherhood, or could refer its intellectual reference to the Muslim Brotherhood. That's, you know, it's a free world. People can do that. But whether they then choose to live up to, you know, the notion that Hassan al-Banna came with, to the values that are essentially the values of Islam, but which were framed within this new thing that Hassan al-Banna came up with, which is called the Muslim Brothers, that's a different matter. So I wouldn't be too hurt if I was to hear that a particular group called the Muslim Brothers behaved in a way that I reject, or went against some of those notions. I wouldn't be surprised, because ultimately we are human beings. But that brings into question another, if I may. I mean, I can talk about how my understanding of societies living under the realms of Islam. You know, Ashfaq, we have a very important saying, or something that we live by. I grew up by. I mean, my father being a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood for an amount of time, he brought us up, myself and my siblings, saying, listen, when you stand before the Almighty on the Day of Judgment, He's not going to give you credit for being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's not a reason why you are, you know, either saved from hellfire or the such. It's something that you understand to be a means where you can perform better, where you can be better, a better version of yourself, and you can then contribute collectively to the betterment of all of society. So I think that the question that needs to be asked here is not how society will look if ruled by a government that is the Muslim Brotherhood. I think we saw a glimpse of the potential of what could that be during the time of Morsi in Egypt, 2012 to 2013. But I would rather say, what is it about the world order in which we live and has been established that prevents the prospect of any kind of reformist movement truly gaining the reins of power? What is it about the world order where people who truly want to rid themselves of the shackles imposed by colonial powers or by international economic, financial institutions such as the IMF or such as the World Bank want to free themselves from those particular shackles? Why is it that they have no chance of survival? What does it speak of? Why is it that a nation or a country that democratically elects a leader or a government in order to establish a certain set of values or practices or policies that agree with a specific culture that might be alien to me here in London, is forbidden from doing so? Why is it that it is so easy, if I'm not happy with any particular country and how it's behaving, to impose sanctions that strangulate that nation and that force it to revert to the way that I want it to be? Why is that? Why is that? So I think that rather than us hypothetically talking about what would happen to a society under the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, I could very flippantly say, well, I'm hoping that according to the realms and values, there would be justice, there would be fairness, there would be equity, there would be a sense of collective responsibility, and there would be a sense of collective right. So I would love to live through that and see how it goes. But the thing is, according to the rules of the game today, that's not even a remote possibility. And hence the problem. So any kind of thinking, it's like that metaphor of a train with several carriages. It's on this track and it's going in that track. Within your carriage, you can do whatever you want. You can change the curtains, you can change the color of the seatings, you can, change the arrangement of the furniture within the carriage. You can do whatever you want, but ultimately speaking, the train is heading in the direction it has, been designed to head. And it seems unfortunate that we live in a world today where you have this image in your mind that you are free, but ultimately you're free only within the scope of the general trend of how things are going. In all honesty, I think this is unsustainable. And I'm not just talking here about Western civilization. Many have commented how Western civilization is on the way down. That, to be honest, it doesn't fill me with joy. It fills me with joy when I hear of an oppressive regime falling. And it doesn't matter whether it's Western, Eastern, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether a dictator is a pious Muslim. That's an anomaly and an oxymoron, but let's assume that person is worthy of bringing down just as anyone else. It doesn't matter that they may be a Muslim. It doesn't matter that they may, pray 5 times a day, fast Thursdays and Mondays, or do all the things that very few Muslims do. It doesn't matter if they're an oppressor, if they are someone who treats people unfairly, unjustly, they need to be brought down. That's no question in my mind. So the question that we need to ask as human beings, and I mean all human beings, how do we change the state of the world so that these aspirations, these ideas can come to fruition without the fear of being collectively attacked, being violated, being genocided, being, as today's term goes, unalived as a result of this? And, one of the most telling, but one of the most ridiculous arguments that was once made to me when Twitter used to be called Twitter was when I was discussing in the aftermath of the Sisi coup in Egypt. I said, listen, if you had let the man Morsi just finish his term, I mean, he had 3 years to go, and then vote him out. He might have been voted out anyway, because probably he might have not, done anything of his promises. So why didn't you do that? And I remember one of the, I would say, semi-famous journalists was engaging with me on Twitter, and he said, well, that would have been catastrophic for Egypt. And I said, why do you say that? And he said, well, we would have been attacked by America and Europe, and we would have. So the excuse for justifying this coup is because if it hadn't happened, then the world will attack you. That it's a sad, but whilst I disagree, and I disagree with the notion or the premise,
he may be correct,
but it's quite telling. And the fact is, well, he wasn't bad. He didn't do anything that I disagreed with. He said all the right things. He made all the right promises, but you know what? The Americans didn't like him, so maybe it's best that we got rid of him. That is a very, very, very sad state of affairs. But unfortunately, it's the state of affairs we have. Today, as I said earlier, international institutions that are there to establish justice, to attain what's truth or otherwise, to assist, are clearly not designed for. You want to call them third world, you want to call them the southern hemisphere, you want to call them but unfortunately they are not designed to assist with human endeavor, human attempt to reach high, to reach better, to reach more developed, to reach self-sustenance, self-determination. Unfortunately, it seems that the world order is stacked against all of those.
Anas Altikriti, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure, Ashfaq. Thank you.
Thank you.